Welcome to Bird Burger, where we talk about all things wildlife and nature oriented. New camera technology has gotten ridiculous over the past few years and made it easier and easier to get good wildlife images. A few years ago, Canon made the switch over to mirrorless and pushed towards upping the standards of what we can expect in a wildlife photography camera. However, as technology gets better and better, so does price get higher and higher. So today, I'm joined by Evan Watts of Watts Wildlife Photography, talking about just is it worth it making all these new investments and staying up to date constantly with our camera system. So how are you doing, man? Thanks for coming on today.
I'm doing pretty good. Been pretty busy recently, but I'm doing well and excited to be on the podcast.
For sure. I'm glad to have you on here. You have some amazing stuff. I've been loving following your stuff on YouTube. Not only do you take some really cool images, but you tell some really cool stories, especially for how newly you've been doing it. You've only been doing it for, a little bit over a year. And it's been really cool to follow you along. So
Thank you.
Yeah, great job at all the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. So recently I know you just decided to invest into getting a Canon 500mm f4 lens, and while you rented out the R3 before, it seems that you've kind of chosen to stuck with the R5 as opposed to the R3, but rather spend your money on that really nice 500mm f4 prime glass, right? Do you mind sharing, some of your thought process on why you made that decision to stick with your R5 and get the new piece of glass instead of investing into maybe an upgraded camera body like the R3?
Yeah, so there were a few reasons for that. For one, really the R5 does everything I needed to do. I didn't really feel like I needed to upgrade to an R3. The R5 totally satisfies my needs and what I need out of a camera. And on top of that, I really felt like I wanted a little more range than I was getting with my 100 to 400, which is what I was shooting on before, was a 100 to 400 zoom.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to upgrade a lens as opposed to a camera body. And my initial reason for actually renting the R3 wasn't even necessarily to see if I wanted to purchase it, but it was more so to make content on it because it was a topic that was hot at the time, and I wanted to, capitalize on that, try to make some content that was going to, help grow my channel, bring in a new audience and stuff like that.
In your experience of renting out the R3, did you kind of come across anything? Because I know you're talking about how the R5 is really what you feel like you need. It satisfies your needs in wildlife photography. Did you feel like in that process of renting out the R3 that you did notice some things where you were like, oh, this is cool, like I wish I had it, but maybe it's still not worth it, right? You're talking about like the R5's, enough for what you need, but was there anything kind of distinguishing about it that you were like, oh man, I kind of did wish I had that?
There was one really big thing. There's this new feature that they have on the R3, and I think it's on the latest 1DX model as well. That's it's called a touch controller, and it's basically a joystick, but it's touchscreen. So you can move your focus point much more quickly, much more accurately. It's lightning fast and moves right with your finger. And it's much better than the joystick. So I really liked that feature, and that is something that I wish was on the R5 that the R3 has.
That's awesome. It's funny, I remember back, this was probably like 2017 or so, but Canon was mentioning that they would never switch to mirrorless. I remember them putting out a statement at a time they never wound up doing that, which at the time I was like, there's no way they're going to stick to that. They're just trying to sell out their DSLR bodies, I think. But of course we know where they are today. We know that they're in the mirrorless lineup, and they're doing a phenomenal job, just like, the other big brands and other brands out there. They have cameras, that rival like the Nikon Z6 or Nikon Z9 even better, or the Sony A7 or the Sony A1. In regards to Canon's mirrorless camera lineup, have you seen like a progression, a pretty healthy and good progression in quality from, their original maybe R5 or R6 to their R3? Do you feel like those have been big steps forward, or do you feel like they've kind of, been re-releasing the same thing? Or what's kind of your whole thought process on, just the improvements they've been making since they've switched to mirrorless?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's been a steady progression. I'd never shot the RP or the R, some of their very first mirrorless cameras, but in comparison from what I've seen from other people shooting on those, the R5 obviously was a huge step up. That was revolutionary with like the animal eye autofocus and all of that stuff that was included on that when it first came out, and nothing like that had ever really been seen before. Now obviously Sony and Nikon have got their own versions of that as well. But that was a huge step up, and particularly between the R3 and the R5, I definitely noticed that everything on the R3 was just slightly better. Besides the fact that it had a lower megapixel count, ISO handling was a little bit better. Autofocus was a little bit faster, a little bit more accurate. Everything was just taken a notch better between those two cameras at least. So I definitely think there's been a steady increase in the quality as they've upgraded. Yeah, for sure.
With new cameras constantly being released, we're talking about Canon right now, but even beyond Canon, right? Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, Olympus, wherever you are, with new cameras just constantly being released. I mean, it feels like, feels like the newest flagship is coming out almost yearly right now at this point. What do you think that balance is between kind of staying up to date with your gear and staying, reinvesting and keep investing in these new and updated products versus kind of just being content with where you're at and learning how to master what you currently do have?
I think that it's got to be a balance that is difficult to strike, and it's also going to depend on your budget and where you need to put money. In my case, I'm a single 20-year-old guy. Like, what else am I going to
college? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like I really just have money to spend on stuff for college and general living expenses, and then besides that, it's like camera gear. But obviously, if you're married and have kids, then you have other priorities. So I think it depends on your budget, and it also I think that you should really try to err on the side of make sure you know your gear first before you even consider upgrading. Like, I like to make sure that before I'm going to upgrade to, or even think about upgrading to another camera or another lens, I really know the gear that I'm using, and I know the full capabilities. I know that I've mastered the full capabilities, and so I know that I really truly am ready to upgrade, and I really know that this is going to take me a step further, if you get what I'm saying.
Most definitely. Yeah, it's very easy. I think there's a lot of value to both, right? It's very easy to become kind of like impatient and just kind of be very quick to just spend money because you think that's going to solve all your problems and that's going to fix all your problems. So it's very easy to do that. But on the other end, it can also be easy to be like, oh, like gear doesn't matter, and then kind of just, just stick with your same system for 20, 30 years, right? When in reality, you probably are missing out on some opportunity because you haven't, invested into nicer pieces of equipment. Of course, like you said, everyone's budget is going to be different, so that's so important to keep in mind and what your priorities are and where you can spend your money. But yeah, I think there's definitely like a balance in there that a lot of times can be difficult to find, and we constantly find that kind of tug both ways as wildlife photographers, typically more often towards the gear end, right, where it's like, yeah, it's that constant pressure of like, I need the newest thing. If not, I'm going to fall behind and I'm not going to be as good as everyone else or whatever. But yeah, it's important to be able to fight that sometimes and kind of just be okay with mastering what you have, what you're saying, at least knowing everything inside out to where a reason why you would upgrade, right? I think that was a valuable point that you just mentioned, rather than just kind of pointlessly spending money, having a good reason for like, you know what? I believe that an upgrade would help me because of this specific reason that my camera body doesn't offer or whatever it may be. So that's really good stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I also believe that it depends on how big of a jump you're making. Like in the case of if you're moving from like a crop body DSLR to a Canon R5 or a Sony A1, that's a much bigger upgrade, and it's going to help improve your ability to take photos much more than upgrading from, say, an R5 to an R3, where it's like everything just stepped up a little bit between those two cameras.
Yeah. I've talked in previous podcasts about rate of return, just kind of that concept of like the rate of return where when you're spending, $1,000, $2,000, and like those more beginner kind of like leaps financially in wildlife photography, you're getting so much more value out of those leaps as opposed to like once you get to those high ends, it's like you're dealing with very tiny increases and very tiny
for sure
quality increases. So yeah, like you said, those original, like, okay, maybe you're investing from like even at something like MFT. Well, I guess even lower than that. You can go like point and click to like now, okay, I'm going DSLR mirrorless, but now you're like maybe on an MFT system, and then you upgrade to an APS-C and then upgrade to a full frame. All those are huge leaps forward at, you know, the lower ranges of thousands of dollars. Versus like, you know, once you're at that $5,000 range, getting the $7,000 camera body is going to be an improvement, but maybe not as big of an improvement, right? So, yeah.
For sure, exactly, yeah.
So one of the things that I think is interesting, and we encounter a lot of times as wildlife photographers, I mean, I guess photographers in general, but one of the hardest parts is that once you get started, in your journey, your hobby or your career, and you invest into your brand, you feel kind of stuck, and like the rest of your career is kind of almost ingrained and entrenched in this brand, right? Is that a struggle that you find yourself being able to relate to? And I'm curious, if you weren't already invested into Canon, would there be any other camera brand you would go for? Or do you think if you restarted, do you think you'd still invest into Canon?
Well, Sony A1 looks pretty awesome. If I were to restart, I think I would probably jump into Sony. But I can say I'm totally satisfied with what I've got from Canon. It does everything I need it to do. But I definitely think that the Sony A1 looks like an awesome camera. I've been very impressed by what I've seen, at least from it, as far as that goes. But yeah, as far as the struggle between, you know, feeling like you're really stuck in a brand, I can definitely relate to that. I got into Canon, to be honest, just based on the fact that I really knew nothing, and a YouTuber that I watched used Canon cameras to film his videos, and I'm like, okay, I'll buy a Canon camera then.
That's you,
yeah. Yeah, and then you're just in it at that point. And so, thankfully, I've loved everything that I've gotten from Canon, but definitely at this point, with how much I've invested in gear, it's like, yeah, I think I'm stuck in Canon for a long time to come, and I can definitely relate to that struggle of like, you know, once you've started in a brand and you've got a big investment in it, you're kind of stuck with what you've got for the time being. So, yeah.
As a Canon user, what do you think, I know you weren't necessarily expecting this question, but as a Canon user, what do you think is one of the most valuable things that Canon maybe has to offer, maybe as opposed to other brands?
Canon, with it being the most popular camera brand in the world generally, I think that they're consistent in their upgrades. You know, you look at like Nikon took a while to get the Z9 out. And, you know, there's been some, in recent years, financial struggles with Nikon. They've had some financial issues, and they still produce great cameras. I've heard great things about the Z9, and all their gear is still incredible. But I think with Canon being such a solid and flagship brand in the general world of photography and cameras, you can always rely on them to be very consistent with coming out with new cameras, new lenses, being, you know, up to date on the latest technology. And their customer service, in my experience, has been really good.
Yeah, Canon is, in wildlife photography, I feel like it's kind of unique in that Nikon and Canon are pretty rivaled in terms of how popular they are, but outside of wildlife photography, Canon is definitely like the biggest name brand in my experience in my career as a videographer, photographer. Outside of wildlife photography, Canon is it's definitely top dog, whereas Nikon is like more of a second thought. Sony has been becoming a more top dog in the outside world as well. In wildlife photography, I think they're still kind of, you know, trying to get up to the same pace. But yeah. Again, though, going back to the struggle we were kind of talking about, I can definitely relate to that. And that, when I first got into photography and videography, I went with Panasonic. That was my brand of choice when I was getting into it, because I was getting into it in video work, and I wasn't doing wildlife photography at all at first. And for video work, this was still back when like mirrorless wasn't a thing, so the only mirrorless companies were like Panasonic and Olympus, or I guess at least notable mirrorless companies were Panasonic and Olympus. And then Sony had just started, but Sony is, you know, everything they do is expensive.
Right.
So even if Sony is good, Sony like charges you out the butt for things. But
for sure, yeah.
But yeah, so I wound up going with Panasonic, and then wound up just kind of being stuck in that. And as a wildlife photographer, one of the most difficult parts that Panasonic is always getting criticized for is their autofocus, and that's definitely a struggle I can relate to, and that's why that's largely why I've chosen to go into the manual focus type of route, right, where I shoot everything virtually manual focus. And while I do think that's a good skill to have regardless, I probably would be more reliant on autofocus if it wasn't for my system. But yeah. So anyway, so yeah, it's definitely interesting how that's your start out in your camera brand kind of determines a lot of the rest of your career, and even how you shoot as a wildlife photographer. So
yeah, for sure, for sure. And like you said, you start out and you really don't know necessarily what you're doing or what you're getting into or where you're going to go as a photographer. Like you said, you didn't even know that you were going to go into wildlife photography. And if you knew some of these things, then maybe you would have made a different choice starting out. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But when you're starting, you just don't know. You just jump in with a brand and then you're stuck with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of to wrap things up, I'd be curious. You were kind of mentioning right now, kind of just knowing your path, knowing kind of the direction you're going, and all those variables that a lot of times we don't really understand or have control over. When we're first getting into it, what would be one of your biggest piece of advice in terms of gear, choosing where to go, what to invest into? What do you think are maybe some things to be aware of, to look out for as a wildlife photographer as you're choosing to kind of progress in that journey and choosing to upgrade gear and stuff like that?
I would say look for stuff that is the best value that you can get out of a camera. So, like for example, if you're looking at your, like compare the R5, for example, to either the Z9 or the A1. The R5 is a lot cheaper than both of those, but it can do almost as much as both of those. Or even compared to like the R3. The R3 is a little bit better, but the R5 can do almost as much as it can. And I'm sure there are other examples out there I'm just not thinking of right now, but look for stuff that really you're getting the most bang for your buck out of it. If you're paying $3,900 for an R5 as opposed to $6,000 for an R3, and your R5 does 90 to 95% of what the R3 can do, then you're getting a lot better value by buying that R5.
For sure, that's a good thing. Yeah, going back to that rate of return concept almost, right? Where you're making sure you're getting the most out of your money. That's cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Thanks for coming on today. Is there any cool projects you're working on your YouTube channel, just in wildlife photography in general right now?
As of this moment, not anything in particular. I've got 4 days left to finals, and then I'm driving back out to spend the summer in Yellowstone and the fall in Yellowstone actually as well. So I'll be putting up tons of content out there with Yellowstone wildlife. So that's really what's to come for my channel in the coming months.
For sure. That's cool. You're going to have a pretty good summer then, it sounds like.
yeah, I can't wait. Counting down the days.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate having you here.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you go subscribe to Watts Wildlife in the description below if you haven't already. He has some really cool videos, especially talking about Canon, if that's a brand that you're interested in. Make sure you subscribe to Bird Burger, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.